Welcome, everybody, to another edition of All In with Art Stapleton, a New York Giants podcast brought to you by NorthJersey.com and The Record. I'm your host, Art Stapleton, and we are back. It's been a while. Had a little bit of a hiatus here for the past month. The New York Giants have not, but after our run of shows at the Combine, we kind of decompressed a little bit, reset. And now that the first couple waves of free agency are over, we are in the thick of the pre-draft evaluation, and we are inside of a month before the NFL draft kicks off the 24th of April in Green Bay, Wisconsin. And the New York Giants are moving forward. We can reset the roster a little bit after the free agency moves that were made. We can talk about that if we have time in today's show, but why waste time? Everybody wants to know what's going on at quarterback. The Giants are no longer a one quarterback room. They have two. That obviously comes with the agreement with Jameis Winston. 2 years, $8 million, $4 million per year average. The guarantees are not a full $8 million, so it essentially locks Jameis in for this season, and then we'll see what happens next season. Obviously, a lot of you believe that the Giants are on a 1 year run here with Joe Shane and Brian Dable and everything that's going on, so that contract would fall in line with the idea of let's see what 2026 looks like when 2026 gets here. But the quarterback situation, we'll run through it, and I'll go top to bottom, and I'll give you my feeling as to what's going on. Aaron Rodgers, where does that stand? Russell Wilson, where does that stand? Does Jameis Winston being here eliminate those situations and the possibilities? Joe Flacco, where does he factor in? And then yesterday we had the first of the series of pro days that truly matter in the quarterback race in the draft, and that was Cam Ward down in Miami. We'll talk about that a little bit. So first off, Jameis Winston agrees on Friday night, and everybody loses their mind. And obviously you knew that was going to happen whenever the Giants get a veteran in here. Throughout this process, it was going to be who was it and how does it impact the draft? And that ultimately those are the two questions that needed to be answered. So now Jameis Winston comes in, 31 years old, and right away you heard Friday into Saturday this idea that the Giants were not out on Aaron Rodgers. The Giants were not necessarily out on Russell Wilson. Joe Flacco, who visited the Giants, is still looming out there, 40 years old. Joe Flacco, and he is a possibility. And I'm going to give you my opinion and my take on what's going on the veteran side of things and what that sets up for the Giants. And then we'll go into the draft, talk about Cam Ward's pro day yesterday and what's to come. All right, first off, are the Giants out on Aaron Rodgers? Well, this is how I'll put it, and this is how it was put to me. If Aaron Rodgers wakes up tomorrow and decides I want to be a Giant, the Giants will take that call, and then they will more than likely bring Aaron Rodgers in to start this season and then see where it goes from there. Now, conventional wisdom, reading the tea leaves, paying attention to what's gone on, I don't necessarily believe that Aaron Rodgers will be a Giant. And I think they know it too. And I think that's part of the reason why they ended up signing Jameis Winston. Well, they haven't signed him yet, but they've agreed to terms. What I do think is that Aaron Rodgers is a lot closer to a long shot than was portrayed by some of his people, or at least people who are making calls on Aaron Rodgers, trying to create a market. And I think it did play out the way we laid it out for you. and that it was initially a last resort for the Giants. Then when the Matthew Stafford thing fell apart and he went back to the Rams, which was always a possibility. We told you that at the Combine, that it was a possibility that he would go back to the Rams, almost a likelihood that he would go back to the Rams. Aaron Rodgers was all gung-ho about getting the Giants involved, getting the Steelers involved, and creating a market. And the Vikings were always involved. So now that Aaron Rodgers is kind of making up his mind, and I joked about this on Friday, and I think some of it is true. Where the jokes come from and the truth, it's kind of that blurred line. And I do think that Aaron Rodgers did not like the news cycle that the Minnesota Vikings told him no. So all of a sudden, in less than 24 hours, Aaron Rodgers is in Pittsburgh visiting with the Steelers, talking to the coaches, talking to the front office. And right away, the immediate take was Aaron Rodgers is going to the Steelers. He's going to sign. It's going to end on Friday. This is the way it's going to happen. And what I put out there was the idea of Aaron Rodgers just wanted to change the narrative that had been created with the Vikings telling him no. So how do you do that? Well, you move your process along one step further, and that is the Pittsburgh Steelers. Be in their building on Friday, talk to them and see where it goes. Well, guess what? It didn't go anywhere. It didn't go where people thought it would. And the reality is that they need to make a decision, they being the Giants. And I think they needed to bring in a veteran quarterback here. So all of a sudden, Rodgers is still on hold on Friday. What do the Giants do? The Giants end up agreeing to terms with Jameis Winston. Now, I've told you all along, I thought it was going to be Russell Wilson. It wasn't. It's Jameis Winston. Now, even when I was pushing Wilson and saying that Rodgers I thought was the best football fit on the market, I had people tell me that Jameis Winston was going to be better in this locker room than Aaron Rodgers or Russell Wilson. When you make calls on it, Russell Wilson, you hear he's a bit of a loner, kind of a phony. Don't really know how he's going to fit in a quarterback room. And that actually carries over from when he left Seattle and went to Denver, what the feeling was in Denver, and then even a little bit when he was in Pittsburgh for Russell Wilson. So I do think that there was this idea that Jameis Winston would be a better fit for what the Giants want to do at quarterback, not just football-wise. They want to bring a young quarterback in here. They want to keep their options open. They want to have an opportunity that if they were able to trade up and get Cam Ward, or they stuck at 3 and picked Shedeur Sanders, or they brought in another quarterback, whether it's late in first round by trading up, or in round 2 or round 3, or wherever else you want to pick a quote-unquote developmental prospect. They want to have a quarterback room that's light, that's not heavy with the gloom and doom, we failed. And by bringing Jameis Winston in, you're almost setting yourself up for that kind of positivity. Because if you brought in Russell Wilson or Aaron Rodgers and you inserted them as the starter and they struggled, then it would be a failure. So there would be a lot of attention split. It would be, yes, you're going to start the young quarterback now in October and give that quarterback an opportunity, but you're also kind of dragging down that quarterback room by now having that cloud hanging over it, whether it's Aaron Rodgers, whether it's Russell Wilson, that those guys failed, that your decision was a bad decision. Jameis Winston, it's a little different. He's here on backup quarterback money. Now, it doesn't mean that he's not going to start the season and he's not going to get a lot of reps with the first team throughout the offseason and then in the summer. But I think they're leaving themselves open. I think it's obvious they don't have control of their situation. We go back to the anniversary of the greatest game ever played, the Colts and the Giants, and for Malik Neighbors, that day, could you have sat him down on the sideline and punted that game? Yes, you could have. But what were the ramifications for that? It's almost like a Back to the Future situation. If you go back, you start altering timelines. What happens? What's the timeline moving forward there? How many people lose their jobs if they lose that game? You may have the number one pick, but you may have a lot of differences that are happening with the Giants. And maybe that was worth it for some people. But the reality is that the Giants are sitting here now where they are. These are the cards that they have to play. And I think they're trying to give themselves as many options as possible while keeping their options open. And all we hear is, what's the plan? What's the plan? I think there are multiple plans. And I think they have to, it's almost a choose your own adventure kind of situation, giving away my age. But it's, if this happens, then we do this. If the Titans trade the number one pick, then we go up and we get Cam Ward. If the Titans don't trade the number one pick, then we stick at 3 and we try to figure out what we're going to do there. And we end up with Shedeur Sanders, or we end up taking a player like a Travis Hunter or an Abdul Carter. And then we have to figure out what we're doing in the first round. Do you the back end of the first round? Do you end up trading back up from 34? Do you stick at 34? There are a lot of things, a lot of discussions that need to happen here. And the Giants really don't control any of them. They can only control what they do in response to what happens outside. And it's an uneasy feeling. It's an uneasy feeling for the fans. I'm sure the team brass is not feeling also great about the decisions that they have, but this is where they're at. So you can't go back in time and all of a sudden talk about how you shouldn't have won that game. Because if you lost that game, there are people here that probably wouldn't even be here. I hate this idea of, well, they would have kept their jobs anyway. The week before the end of the season, all I heard, well, they can't keep Brian Daboll and Joe Schoen, even though I told you what they were going to do. It wasn't me being condescending or saying, I know what's going on and you don't. I felt as though they were staying. Had they lost that Indianapolis game, I don't know if they would be here. I don't know if they would have cut ties. And I know there's a part of the fan base who says, so what? We would have been better off if Joe Schoen and Brian Daboll aren't here. But that's not the reality that you're in. And you have to move forward with what you have. So, again, I don't think Aaron Rodgers will be the quarterback of the Giants. Could it happen? Sure. It's Aaron Rodgers. He makes his own mind up on his own timeline. But I think the Giants bringing in Winston here was their way of moving forward, at least in this quarterback room, and setting themselves up for what the next step will be. I told you this 3 weeks ago on social media, that if it wasn't Rodgers, I could certainly see the Giants signing 2 free agent veteran quarterbacks. That could still happen. Could that be Jameis Winston and Joe Flacco plus a rookie plus Tommy DeVito, and then see how that plays out in the offseason and then in the summer? I think that certainly could happen. Do I think Russell Wilson and Jameis Winston and a rookie and Tommy DeVito works? I'm not sure that that's the best mix to bring in here. Could it happen? Sure. Will it happen? I'm not so sure. So what will the Giants get from Jameis Winston? Look, I'm all for saying, he's an entertaining player, but he's an entertaining player in a losing season. My feeling is that Brian Daboll looked at Jameis Winston, saw his body of work, and said, I think I can get more out of this 31-year-old quarterback than maybe I can get out of a 41-year-old Aaron Rodgers, a 40-year-old Joe Flacco, or a 36-year-old Russell Wilson. Now, that's not far-fetched. If you look at those guys and say, I don't know how much more they have left in the tank, and then I look at Jameis Winston, say, you know what? I know what I'm going to get here. I can work around that. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that all of a sudden Jameis Winston is going to turn into a winning player. But what it does mean is that they are going to have an opportunity here to figure out their quarterback situation. And if Jameis Winston is the one who's going to be playing, they need to gear their offense around Jameis Winston and what he does well. And what he does well is also what he doesn't do so well. And I think that's up to the coaching staff. It's up to Jameis to figure out what's going on. But right now, we have time if Jameis Winston becomes quarterback one here for the Giants to talk about his impact. But him coming here sets up this next step. And the next step started on Monday in Coral Gables, Florida, with the Cam Ward Pro Day. I watched on my laptop, watched the streaming from NFL Network, NFL Plus, watching the Pro Day, which was supposed to start around 4 o'clock, didn't get going really until around 20 to 6. And, you know, we saw it all. We see what we see at Pro Days. We see the contingencies from the various teams, and we try to read body language. And Cam Ward makes a throw and says something in the direction of the Tennessee Titans brass. And all of a sudden, that's going to be dissected. And we saw Joe Shane talking to Cam Ward, and they were smiling. And Shea Tierney and Mike Kafka were standing in the end zone behind Cam Ward. He's making throws. There, you're seeing their silhouettes in the background. This is what we do to Pro Days. We're trying to piece everything together. And they'll do it again on Tuesday. Quinn Ewers in Texas have their Pro Day. I will not be surprised if the Giants have a contingent there. The big question yesterday, where was Brian Daboll? Why wasn't Brian Daboll there? Look, if you want to read into it and you want to say, well, the Giants didn't think that Cam Ward was ever going to get to them, so why would Daboll go to the Pro Day? I can't refute it. I can make as many calls as I can to the Giants. Their preference during draft time is to keep as much information. They believe information is power. So whatever you are seeing, they can't control that. But they could try to control why they're sending certain guys to certain schools, what their plans are. My guess is the Giants will still have a private workout with Cam Ward. They'll still bring him into their facility, and then Brian Daboll will be heavily involved there. Brian Daboll was at the Combine when they met with Cam Ward, so this idea that Brian Daboll has not really interacted with Cam Ward is just not true. Was it a little weird? Was it surprising to me a little bit to not see Daboll there? A little bit. But I think back to last year and the way sometimes these Pro Days and the travel for the Pro Days and the travel for the private workouts, they intersect, they overlap. And last year, Brian Daboll and Joe Shane were at Washington for Rome Odunze and Michael Penix Jr., and they were not at Drake May. And Brian Daboll was not at Drake May's Pro Day. So this idea that, you know, we all know the Giants would have done anything they could to get either Jaden Daniels or Drake May last year, and they couldn't. Brian Daboll wasn't at Drake May's Pro Day. So that's all you need to know. You know, what goes on, teams have to make calls. And, you know, I heard this from some people yesterday. Well, why couldn't Daboll just get on a private plane and go from this school to that school and this school to that school? Yeah, he could have. He could have done that. But they have their coordination as to how they're doing it. This isn't made up. This schedule is not made up last week. They talk about this 3 weeks ago, 4 weeks ago. Okay, here's how we're going to set this up. This is where we're going to go. We're going to have this visit here, this visit there. Don't forget, last year at this time, there was so much talk about the Giants and J.J. McCarthy. The Giants spent the Saturday before Easter in Ann Arbor working out J.J. McCarthy, went to dinner with J.J., had a private workout, and the feeling was, if you remember, Peter Schrager came on All In, and we talked about that visit and the Giants meeting with McCarthy. Why would they spend Easter weekend if they weren't interested in J.J. McCarthy? Well, a year later, we look back on that, and I can tell you that the Giants liked McCarthy a lot. But when he came to their facility, he was one of the guys that came to the facility, and their perception changed a little bit. The feeling was that maybe this didn't fit for him, the idea of being in this market, and maybe he was just a different kind of guy and, needed a little bit of a slower pace. And, they may be totally wrong. J.J. McCarthy may have come here and lit it up, but that was the feeling that I hear now. You hear after the fact. Now, Joe Schoen at the Combine talked about that, not mentioning McCarthy, not mentioning anyone, but talked about being the quarterback of the Giants in this market, things that they needed to sort out throughout this process. That's something to consider. Everybody coming out of Cam Ward's pro day now believes the Titans are taking Cam Ward, and they may. And if I had a guess today, I'd say Cam Ward is going to Tennessee at number 1. But I've seen a lot that happens on the pro day circuit, and we talk visits, and we talk people coming in for top 30 visits and all this stuff. There's still a lot to be determined over the next 3.5 weeks. And on face value, it may sound like, what are you kidding me? Like, come on, we know where their boards are, but they don't. Like, they have not decided. If you got Joe Schoen to talk on the side, Joe, who do you like? Who do you not like? He'd probably give you who his top guys are. But as far as whether their plans are in stone, they can't be, because they still have to follow the process. And the one thing about Joe Schoen and the way he's tried to set this up, you could disagree with his process, but he believes in all these checks and balances. So that's what you're going to see here. A lot of times it's to confirm your opinions, not form them. And what I mean by that is, by this time, so many people in the organization have met with all these guys. And it goes back to the scouts, going to games, going to practices, when those players were not 3.5 weeks away from their future. So that's what I've come to learn about draft season, is that it's not about forming an opinion. It's about confirming an opinion or refuting an opinion. You may have something in your scouting report about a player that you want to see if you're right or wrong about that. More times than not, when you see a player at a pro day or you hear something about them, it leads you back to the film. All right, did I see something there? Well, how did he perform with that in games? And let's not forget, the pro day is all scripted, and the pro day is scripted by the player. The private workout is scripted by the team. And that's two different things. So, what do we make of Cam Ward? Look, Cam Ward showed what Cam Ward is. He's got great arm talent, and he seemed to enjoy the moment on Monday. Was it perfect? Was it oh my God? No. But these pro days have to move away from that. You have to get that out of your system. It's not about what they do at the pro day. It's about everything else that comes with it. It's another opportunity to see this guy. And from a perspective of where the Giants are, Brian Daboll not being there yesterday probably got more attention than had he been there. And we could form all of our opinions, but the Giants need to use that to their advantage here, because we all believe we know what they're going to do. April 4th, Shedeur Sanders has his pro day. They're calling it a showcase at Colorado. Travis Hunter and the rest of the prospects there at Colorado, but Shedeur will throw that day. The Giants should have a big contingent there, almost as big as yesterday. All right, who was there for the Giants yesterday? I can tell you this is not even through confirmation, but it's through video confirmation that I can see who was there. Joe Schoen was there. Tim McDonald was there. Brandon Brown was there. Mike Kafka, Shea Tierney, and Tim Kelly, the tight ends coach. Tim Kelly also has experience in being the offensive coordinator down in Tennessee, but also he did a lot of coordination with the Giants offensively last year. Their game planning, a lot of stuff. Tim Kelly was involved. He got a lot of credit for their screen game last year when it really clicked early on in the year. So that was the Giants contingent yesterday. And look, this was not the first time that Joe Schoen and Tim McDonald and Brandon Brown were at a Miami practice or at the facility seeing Cam Ward. At the bowl game, Joe Schoen and Tim McDonald were there. So that's where we're at. Has anything changed? I think most people around the NFL still believe that the Titans are going to take Cam Ward at number 1. So does that eliminate the chances for a trade with the Giants? Most likely. But if Tennessee doesn't say it's over, then Joe Schoen stays engaged. But you have to kind of move on to that next plan, the next part of the plan. So that's where we're at. That's where we're going to move forward now. What do the Giants do? Well, I think the Giants will stay at 3. Could there be a flip with the Browns to think, okay, we're going to get up and, if they don't want Shedeur Sanders, flip us a pick to guarantee that you get him? Maybe. I can't rule that out. But the Shedeur Sanders stuff, and we're going to have to do a whole show on that, maybe next week from the owners' meetings. I might as well tease that now. The owners' meetings get down to Palm Beach on Sunday, and the owners' meetings are Sunday, Monday, Tuesday. We should hear from Joe Schoen and John Mara. And then Brian Dable is available at the NFC Coaches Breakfast on Tuesday morning. That'll be the first time Dable has talked since the season ended, at least talked publicly. So we'll be there with him. It's usually around 25 minutes or so, all at the same table, sitting there with Brian Dable. So that'll be an interesting one. So put that on your radar for next week. They're early mornings down there at West Palm Beach, and we'll try to get as much information as we can to see where the Giants are at after that. So, look, it's been no secret. I think Shedeur Sanders would be a good fit here. I hear all of you talk about the idea of you're worried about Deion, you're worried about the presence of Deion, you're worried that Deion is going to be, that overview of, well, if I got this morning on social media. If Shedeur has a bad game, or if the offensive line has a bad game, Deion's going to go on social media, or he's going to go to his press conference and rip the Giants offensive line. What have you seen from Deion Sanders to make you believe that? Deion Sanders is going to be coaching his own team out in Colorado. He's not the coach of the Giants. He doesn't want to be the coach of the Giants. So what has Deion Sanders done to make you think that he's going to do that? And let's say he does. Deion Sanders goes out and rips the Giants publicly. First off, I think he's smarter than that. Secondly, is that any different than the Giants getting ripped up and down by anyone who has a microphone? There is no difference. It's the same thing. Yes, it's the parent of your starting quarterback, but it's happened before. And I'll say this again. This happens a lot more in back channels than you think. And agents and family members and people in the inner circle, the idea that people talk about criticism of coaches and front office and ownership happens all the time. So I'm going to check this out because somebody just signed with the Giants. I'm trying to see who it is. All right, Aaron Stinney has re-signed. We knew that was happening last week. Now it's official. So, see, that's how it happens. So, like I said, I can't tell you it's never going to happen. I can't tell you that Deion Sanders isn't going to say something about the Giants, something critical about the Giants. But this idea that it's automatically going to happen and you need to exclude Shedeur Sanders because of that, You had Amani Toomer a couple weeks ago saying nobody wanted to come to the Giants and play here. And then second day of free agency, Paulson Adebo, one of the top corners in the league, and Javon Holland, one of the top safeties on the market, both came to New York with very few ties to the New York Giants. So does it hurt the Giants that Amani Toomer is going out there and saying these things? Sure, it hurts them a little bit because you've got people who love and appreciate Amani Toomer. But guys are going to have opinions. You got to thicken up that skin. You got to be able to handle that and figure out how you can move past it, how you can ignore the noise. And if Deion Sanders decides that in October he wants to take shots publicly at the Giants, he's going to do that. But what about Deion Sanders makes you think he's going to do that? I think there's this caricature of who people think Deion Sanders is versus who Deion Sanders actually is. And I think that needs to play itself out because it's very easy for people to just jump on random things and run with it as if they're fact. And I just don't think that's going to happen. So I mentioned Adebo. I mentioned Javon Holland. Here's where I see the Giants after free agency. I think they're still gonna look for a right guard, potentially in the draft, starting right guard. If it's someone who's traditionally played left guard, they can always move John Runyon Jr. to right guard. I think Greg Van Roten is a good signing to get here, to come back and kind of be your top reserve. I think they like Jake Kubas, undrafted rookie from last year. I think he'll factor in the mix, and I think it leaves himself open. But, I keep hearing how bad the Giants' offensive line is. Look, 2-3 years ago, absolutely. When they were healthy last year, they were an average offensive line. And you know what? If you get good quarterback play and good play from your skilled players, and you get average offensive line play, you're going to win a lot more games than what they did last year. So I think, look, I can be proven wrong that this offensive line, and I know it's an unpopular opinion, but I don't think this offensive line is as bad as people think it is. And again, it comes down to health. I mean, if Andrew Thomas is at left tackle, they need to build up the line behind the starters because guys get hurt. You're not going to go through an entire season where guys are not going to get hurt. And sometimes that's part of the problem. But I don't think this offensive line is going to be an outright disaster like some people have said. And I do think they could be an average team. Look, not an average offensive line. So we'll have to see how that plays out. That's pretty much all I got, I think, today. I think next week we'll have a lot more information. It's going to be good to have boots on the ground again to talk to people in person. This is a weird time of year where, the information that's out there, who do you trust? It's lying season, so teams use lies to their benefit or half-truths to their benefit. And I've tried to use my experience to avoid that. And that's just where we're at. So other than that, I think we've got everything covered. That's how I feel on the quarterback situation. Where the roster is, there's still a work in progress. I think the Giants still have a lot of work to do. I think in the draft, I think you may see a running back. I think you may see a three technique up front, defensive line. Still, there's room for that. I think, obviously, we said right guard. Then you get into day 3 where you're taking developmental players. And obviously the quarterback situation is something that's going to continue and evolve over the next week, 2-3 weeks, heading into the NFL draft, which, as I said, April 24th, we're now at March 25th. So it's coming. It's coming fast. So for Paul Wood, I'm Art Stapleton. Thanks for watching. Thanks for listening to the latest edition of All In. And as always, we are all in, and we appreciate you being all in too. So if there's no breaking news the rest of this week, we will be back with a couple episodes from the owners' meeting next week. Keep it right here. Keep checking all our coverage out on NorthJersey.com, and we appreciate you as always. Come to the source that you trust, and that's us here at All In and at NorthJersey.com.